There is a terrible rite of passage that we share as human beings. And it is the confronting of a dark and deep shame for something very difficult to face. I want to share what that is in this video, and I want to share with you how the facing of this shame, the acknowledging of the shame, is the very step that we need to take in order to liberate ourselves from the hold of our egoic personality and all the suffering that we have as human beings. This channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo, and in today's video I'm going to make a very counterintuitive statement of how the acknowledging of how your egoic self hates embodied life is the very thing that you need in order to transcend the ego and live a very different kind of life from the one that the average human being lives in a lot of suffering and dissatisfaction. In order to make a case for that statement, which sounds perhaps very triggering or completely nonsensical, I would like to go back to the origin of how our psyche develops when we're very young. I've mentioned in the past how at some point in our infancy we come to realize not only that we are sentient, but also that we are a separate entity in the world, which is completely vulnerable. The sensations from our body are overwhelming and distressful. And it feels very unsafe. In fact, it feels so unsafe that our mind, our psyche, in order to protect itself, creates a mental space to which we retreat. In essence, what that does is it creates a place in the mind in which our attention can inhabit, and it can disassociate from directly feeling the body because it feels completely unsafe to us at that stage in our development. It's important to mention that that move away from body sensations, away from directly feeling our self, is a defensive move, and it is a healthy move at that point in our lives. What tends to happen over time is that what starts as a defensive move becomes a sickly habit. Our mind, having disassociated from the body and created this mental space in which we live in our heads, starts to develop ideas of its own about never really wanting to return to those body sensations. In fact, it starts to find them altogether threatening, distasteful, and altogether hateful. And it wants to live as a kind of a ghost in the machine. The sensation of that is feeling that you are this ghost behind your eyes. And that mental process that wants to be just a floating ghost that doesn't feel the body, it essentially wants to feel like it's invulnerable. So the body sensation and its mortality is seen as a horrible threat that it just wants to ignore and disassociate from. At the same time, our body keeps sending nagging signals all the time. It has cravings, it has pains, it makes our emotions have a certain bite. Yeah, so we wouldn't mind our emotions so much unless we felt somatically in the body a certain kind of like or dislike. And the mind cannot ignore that, of course. So there's a serious hatred and dislike from the egoic mind for the somatic sensations in the body because they are a constant reminder of its vulnerability. So if you have followed so far, a defense mechanism in the mind disconnects us from directly feeling the body as a defensive move. That defensive move becomes a habit and develops a force of its own, and it wants to maintain itself by perpetuating that disassociation, and it develops a kind of a hatred for sensations in the body. Now, if that is plausible so far, then the next step in understanding this situation is how our sensations in the body, our perceptions, sensory perceptions, are what our real life is made of. In other words, that space to which we retreated in our head is just a mental space. It's a kind of facsimile of life, a kind of mental fake. Real life is made up of real sensations, most of which are actually somatic. And when you realize that the egoic personality's hatred for somatics is actually then a hatred for real life. So the ego hates embodied life. And this would not be a problem if the ego was just a mental function. But as it happens, our awareness becomes completely identified with our egoic personality. In other words, through our human development, our mind becomes completely enmeshed with our thoughts, our opinions, our memories, our tendencies. It becomes completely identified with all these mental activities, and therefore we see life through the lens of the egoic personality. When you see your life through that lens, even though you might not want to admit it to yourself, you actually hate inhabiting your body because of the vulnerability of this looming chance of overwhelm and death that it represents. So I want to be very careful in explaining this because it might sound like I'm saying we all hate our lives or something of the kind. What I'm trying to explain, it's a very nuanced point, is that seen through the lens of egoic identification, we confuse the egoic hatred in the state for somatics as the psychological sense of I hate my life. Now, here comes the twist in the story and the liberating point about this whole thing, which is that if we are doing our work of meditation, self-cultivation, and we keep observing the ego, there comes a point where we start to observe the ego's darkest tendencies. We start to acknowledge our darkest and deepest fears. We start to acknowledge our darkest and deepest desires. The more we do that, we come to recognize them as nothing other than mental phantoms, activities of the mind that are not defining of who we are. And to my mind, the biggest and darkest of them all is that we can acknowledge, I feel like I hate my life. It sounds like a very dark thing to do. It sounds like a completely counterintuitive thing to do. But when we have enough sincerity to acknowledge that we feel that we feel a deep, dark hatred in the back of our head, in the deep recesses of our psyche, the moment we acknowledge that, we allow ourselves to see the true face of the ego, the true face of our egoic function, which is the hatred of embodied life. And that gives us the key, or it gives us the opportunity to then disidentify from it as just another mental function. You will notice just how gloomy and heavy this topic is. It's kind of a shameful taboo to say that you hate your life. And I would argue that shame for acknowledging hatred for your life is the ego's last line of defense. The chances that you will willingly go into that are very slim. Your awareness is constantly trying to avoid that. And if you don't believe me, just try to sit and meditate for 2 hours in a row. Chances are you will try anything to distract yourself from your sense of raw embodiment. Emotions and thoughts will keep coming up. You'll do anything to get out of that situation, because raw embodiment is the most dislikable thing to an identity that is enmeshed with its egoic functions. So what this video is about is to bring light to the fact that acknowledging hatred for your embodied life, as strange as that sounds, is the only way that you can see the ego's real face, to come completely face to face with it, identify it as nothing other than a deep dark mental function that had a real good reason for existing. It protected you at some point, and then it became this sickly cycle out of which it's impossible to escape unless seen for what it is, despite of how awkward or painful that move may appear, especially in society, but also to yourself, right? Very difficult to admit to yourself that you feel like you hate your life. And what I'm trying to provide you here is with a plausible reason to acknowledge that, maybe even a reason to notice that it's there, because it's a very repressed type of situation. And in doing so, you are all but ready to see the ego in its entirety, because that is primarily what it is. If you believe that these are topics that are interesting, do subscribe to the channel, do like the video, and if you think there's someone who might benefit from listening to this kind of content, do share it as well. And as usual, I'll be back with more. Thank you very much.